Thank you very much, Benedetto. And thank you, everybody, especially the IPAM organizers, for inviting me today. I hope there's not too much background noise because I'm working from home, as many of you are as well. And today I'm going to talk about a project that was long lasting and we have not yet completely published, but where we have had some really interesting results looking at active perception under pressure. This work also includes studies on humans and primates, and it was motivated by our previous work on sensor systems. As you know, there are now many examples of networks of sensors that are deployed in environmental scenarios and contexts such as the ocean, littoral environments, as well as urban environments, in order to gather information about targets and other environmental conditions and important objects of interest. So for many years, we addressed the problem of sensor navigation and control by realizing that in the traditional paradigm, the sensor measurements were merely fed back to the vehicle in order to improve the ability to move from A to B and avoid obstacles, and also meet some classical control criteria such as stability and robustness. So the measurements primarily pertained to the vehicle itself, and therefore many of these methods were not directly applicable to this type of sensors that are installed on vehicles primarily deployed in the environment in order to obtain information that we can consider exteroceptive in nature, meaning external to the vehicle. So we address this new paradigm in which the vehicle and onboard sensors are deployed primarily to address objectives such as detection, classification, localization, and tracking, also known as DCLT, which are also generalizable to many scenarios in which sensors are deployed to observe, interpret scenes, and as part of that process, detect, classify, and track multiple targets. So some of the research challenges we addressed early on were to obtain sensor objectives in closed form. That was accomplished primarily using information theory and computational geometry, and also including information about the environment itself and the targets as part of those objectives and feedback to the guidance and control, the guidance and control law on board the vehicle. So up to a few years ago, there were many techniques that have been introduced for addressing this class of problems. So this is just a brief overview. Each one of these methods had certain drawbacks. In particular, some of the early methods for using probability theory, as well as graphical models such as POMDPs, in order to plan the behaviors and motions of sensors, were too abstract and did not consider geometric constraints such as the bounded field of view. Later on, viewpoint planning and also sensor network control try to address individually some of these additional constraints, but in every case, it neglected to incorporate all of the information we had about the sensors as well as their vehicles or platforms. So we developed an approach that could take into account not just the vehicle kinematic constraints, but also the sensor model and the sensor geometries, in particular those of the field of view. And that approach was recently described in a book that will appear next year, co-authored by myself and Tom Weddergren, one of my collaborators. And the overall approach we refer to as information-driven sensor planning and control is also known as informative path planning, and relies on the use of measurement models such as either traditional classical measurement models or probabilistic measurement models that are more general in nature and typically can be represented by graphical models such as Bayesian networks and influence diagrams. By this approach, we were also able to account for the geometries of the targets and the vehicle and the sensor field of view, which typically has a bounded geometry that doesn't allow the sensor to view targets anywhere in the environment, but rather confines the ability of the sensor to its range or, as I mentioned, field of view or visibility region. So we looked at the problem in the context of geometric results in robot path planning and realized that the sensor path planning problem was the dual of robot path planning. So here is a simple example of how we came to that realization. So in robot path planning, typically the algorithms seek to prevent intersections between the geometry of the platform, which in this case it will be a robot, and the geometry of the obstacle. In sensor path planning, because we want to have the targets be inside the field of view, the algorithms ought to essentially achieve intersections between the sensor field of view, such as, for example, a conical shape representing a camera field of view, and the geometry of the target in order to enable measurements. So by looking at this paradigm from this perspective and using disjunctive inequalities, we were able to show that if we treat the C obstacles, which are obstacles mapped onto configuration space, as a set of disjunctive inequalities, and similarly, we do the same for C targets, except in this case, we attempt to include the C target in the sensor field of view, we can show that there is a duality between the two problems. And in fact, if we consider multiple targets and multiple obstacles, we were able to show that the robot path planning problem is the dual of the sensor path planning problem, and both are mixed integer programs. So this result appeared in the paper down below and was also complemented by the development of several information gain functions. First of all, the expected entropy reduction, and then later other information theoretic functions that allowed us to also take into account the information value of targets in the environment based on a number of considerations that included environmental conditions as well as prior information about the targets and measurement models. So with using these type of objective functions that are now known as information gain functions, we were then able to plan the motion of the sensor so as to optimize its ability to gather information from the environment and in particular targets and objects of interest. So some examples I'm going to show very quickly to give you some perspective of what this paradigm was able to achieve are search while tracking. So this type of application is motivated by search and rescue and monitoring and surveillance applications. In this case, we used Bayesian non-parametric target models and similarly related measurement models. And we look at examples in which for a network of cameras that were reconfigurable using pan, tilt, and zoom parameters were charged with observing and constructing models from many moving targets without any prior knowledge of the target dynamics. So essentially, these cameras were tasked with reconstructing the target dynamics purely from data using a bounded field of view that was reconfigurable by means of these onboard parameters. So here you see the results in which using information gain functions that we developed specifically for Bayesian non-parametric models, we were able to control the cameras in an optimal fashion to where we in fact were able to model the dynamic of targets that were completely unknown a priori using a bounded field of view, and in fact in many cases less cameras than there were targets. You will see that this algorithm actually outperformed any more traditional approaches such as those of just simply maintaining the targets in the field of view because it aimed to optimize information gain. Another application that we recently completed is what we call perception in action, which seeks to incorporate recent results in computer vision, particularly methods such as object recognition and pose and action recognition and estimation, with the action of, again, an active sensor that consists typically of a moving vehicle equipped with onboard sensors. In this case, we consider primarily cameras in the visible spectrum. So there are many interesting methods being developed by the computer science, computer vision community, including convolutional neural networks and sparse feature methods. And in recent years, we made some improvements on existing methods that allow us to utilize computer vision to perform actions that allow the robot to interact with its environment solely using the onboard camera and video feedback. So some of the main challenges we had to overcome were to provide computer vision algorithms that would be fast enough and reliable enough to allow for real-time control of the vehicle. When we achieved these results, we then developed a hybrid controller that allowed the vehicle to switch between different modes based on the scene and the behaviors of actors in the scene. So in particular, the onboard controller, which in this case will be demonstrated on a moving drone, was equipped with both pose, object, and action recognition, so actually all three, and also with target tracking and following algorithms, so as to maintain the target of interest in the field of view. And at the same time, was also tasked with occlusion avoidance and collision avoidance algorithms. So you will see now how we basically were able to demonstrate this controller, which can be applied to a broad range of tasks to interact with humans. In particular, we're interested in an interaction that can allow humans to use natural language through semantic segmentation, and also gestures such as pointing and waving without, in fact, interacting with the onboard software, all through the video feedback. So the idea was to have the drone programmed so that it would be able to recognize actions such as waving, also appearance, such as wearing a particular type of glasses, and then also follow gestures such as pointing and respond to those gestures and those features of the humans in the scene in real time. So this particular drone was programmed to identify as a human of interest somebody who waved at the drone, and then as you will see here, use the onboard computer vision to execute those commands, and also upon the human waving a second time, land near that human as essentially another form of perception in action. And there are more examples of these videos on our website. So this brings me to the main topic of my talk today, which is having accomplished these different types of active sensing capabilities, what happens when these vehicles and these robots are in a real world environment and are subject to pressures that could not be anticipated a priori. So what we started doing some years ago with funding from ONR was to explore the area of human satisficing decision making. So human satisficing decisions were first analyzed years ago by Simon and Cadane, first and foremost, now about 20 or 30 years ago, who studied how humans made decisions in complex scenarios, such as the trading stocks on Wall Street, where essentially the decision-making is only satisfactory. It may not necessarily be optimal, but it still achieves the ultimate goal, and therefore is good enough even when time pressure, incomplete observations, and insufficient modeling and information prevent us from implementing optimal decisions. So Simon and Cadane then having analyzed the human behaviors and decisions in real settings, transferred that understanding in a essentially mathematical framework, which came to be known as the search for Spanish treasures, which is a type of inferential decision-making problem in which humans or computers are asked to make decisions based on incomplete information, and in particular, for example, example, with some hidden variables that determine both the cost and the reward of the search. So this is analogous to a human or a robot wanting to dig slices underground without obviously knowing where the treasure is buried and having some prior probability of where the treasure might be located. And having dug every one slice must pay a cost to reveal whether there is a treasure in that slice or not. And then from there decide whether to continue, again at a cost, by essentially continuing to dig until the treasure is eventually found. So the idea being that even if the search is not optimal, the human or robot should be able to use some kind of strategy that allows it eventually to find the treasure. So this type of problem can be represented mathematically as an AND or tree with ordering constraints. And so what we decided to do in order to make the results more applicable to the type of sensing problems that I introduced in the first part of my talk was to consider an extension of this problem, which we had already developed for robotic sensor path planning, known as the treasure hunt. So this is a mathematical description of the treasure hunt, but essentially it amounts to the problem of having a robot with an onboard sensor that is looking for targets in an obstacle-populated environment. And here you will see targets of different colors, magenta, blue, and so forth, while obstacles are denoted by the gray color. And in this case, the robot wants to maximize the information gain, therefore, in order to classify these targets correctly, as well as minimize the distance travel so as to finish the treasure hunt as quickly as possible. So we use this paradigm to investigate satisficing inferential decision-making in more complex settings. And we worked with a fairly large group that I'm going to acknowledge at the end of our presentation. And it includes Professor Agner and Professor Summers at Duke University. And in this project, we explored a number of studies on both human and non-human primates in which the subjects were presented with satisficing experiments that had an underlying framework identical to that of the treasure hunt. So we used this underlying framework, which can be modeled using a Bayesian network and influence diagram, both to design the experiments and later to analyze the data that resulted from those experiments. So some of the experiments involved experiments on desktops. And here we used, for example, the immersive WeBot environment so that we could look at both active and dynamic satisficing tasks. And in this case, we also imposed ordering constraints as in the original satisficing tree search, except here the ordering constraints pertain to the queue discovery. And the environments were considered complex because it had obstacles, limited visibility, as well as clutter, meaning objects that are not necessarily targets. The human or the primate were allowed to control a robot puck through this environment so that we would be able to measure accurately the field of view, the position, and the orientation of the agent in that environment, and therefore determine without any uncertainty what targets were visible and what were the resulting visual cues. So the goal again for this robot, which in this case is piloted by a human, is to search the environment for targets without actually knowing which objects are the targets, and then by paying a price, discovering cues about these targets and making decisions about whether they are or not the actual treasure based on the visual cues. So the robot puck, which is piloted by the human in many cases, in other cases by our algorithm, was essentially this type of ground robot with a known field of view. And of course, if we had a target, in the environment, the robot and the human, by this approach, were only able to see the target if it was indeed inside the field of view, and the robot had the proper configuration, and which included the orientation. So we were able to account for visibility constraints. In terms of the classification problem, we wanted to consider inferential decision-making problems that could easily transfer to active sensors and also enable these type of robots to better interact with humans by making more similar decisions. And therefore, we looked at classification problems in which the sensor or the human would be able to observe cues such as shape, color, and texture. So in this case, if we have a target that looks like a basketball, of course, if we can see the basketball, we know its shape, round, its color, orange, the texture having a pattern. And from that, we can classify this as a basketball. And with some prior learning, we may be able to infer whether this type of object is a treasure or not. So this was the type of classification problem that was given to both the humans and the robots. We considered many different types of targets placed in the environment along with other clutter. And at the initial time, the targets may or may not have had any of the cues displayed. So for example, each target, let's take a spherical target once again, at the initial time might not actually display any visual cues. And the robot and human would be forced then to visit that target, include it in the field of view, pay a cost, and then display with ordering constraints the different visual features. So that by this approach, we were able to determine the role of the visual features or cues on the decision-making and classification decision that the humans and robots were making. So for example, we considered many types of spherical targets. Here are some examples. And then also many types of rectangular targets. So here are some other examples. Using Bayesian network model, we were able to also model the relationship between the targets, the cues, and their ultimate classification into either treasure or not. So this was the Bayesian network structure that we also used to design the experiments so that we could control the difficulty of the classification problem and later analyze the results having the ground truth behind the experimental design. So the Bayesian network in this case, after having been designed, can be sampled, and then from the sampling of the Bayesian network, the experiment is designed based on the sampled cues and classification values. In order to look at different types of pressures, we consider time, cost, and also sensory interruption. We use this WeBot environment at first, and then we also moved to virtual reality experiments where we were able to control, for example, the amount of fog, which is one of the pressures we considered. And here you can see both how the fog influences the ability to see the targets at the ground level for the actual robot and with a bird eye view. And we were able to control the amount of fog as well. So here you see how the human studies were conducted. So there was a learning phase during which the human essentially learned these underlying probabilities, which in principle could have been given to the robot, for example, and represent the probability of the target being a treasure or not based on its visual cues. And so the human, not knowing what those probabilities are, went through a learning phase in which each object was presented many times, and the cues and they were displayed incrementally to the human, as you can see here. And then the human gave a decision as to whether this target was or not a treasure. After that, the feedback was provided to the human so that the human would know that this was indeed or not a treasure. So if you have any questions, please let me know. So essentially, this allowed the human to learn the relationship between the visual cues and the type of classification. Following the learning phase, the humans were then brought to a testing phase. So here's an example for us that is taken from our studies on cost constraints. Now, remember, every time the human decides to view a visual cue, he or she has to pay a cost. So here we constrain the total amount of money that the human could use to see the influence of information cost on the human decisions. In this case, because we're in the testing phase, there is no classification feedback provided to the human. The human knows that he or she has to classify all the targets in the environment, and also is aware of this cost pressure. However, every pressure was applied individually. So when we applied cost pressure, there was no time pressure and no sensory interruption. We also performed studies in virtual reality settings. So let me go in the interest. Yeah, so here is, excuse me, I think I skipped a slide. So here is instead the human study in WeBot with the sensory interruption, which is the fog. And you can see that we also had a variety of occlusions. So we actually placed targets purposely under tables and under chairs to make the problem more difficult. And so you can see this is a test phase for a human when there is fog in the environment. And again, in this case, we had no cost pressure and no time pressure, but we had the sensory interruption. And of course, being in test phase, the human was not provided with any classification feedback. So we then took these studies in virtual reality so that we could also see how humans behave when, instead of controlling a robot, they're able to walk around and interact with the targets directly. So in order to do so, we worked in the virtual reality cave known as the Dive at Duke University. And this is a cave that is a 3x3 region where humans can move around, and actually typically they do so with a wand instead of walking. And it's an interactive environment, so they can also interact with the targets and inquire for the cues as on the desktop. But in this case, they have this physical presence that we hope would give more realism to the studies, the behavioral studies that we performed. So here is an example of one of our subjects interacting with the targets within this virtual environment in the presence without the fog in this case. And you can see that by clicking on the wand is able to reveal cues and then classify the targets as either treasures or non-treasures. Then we repeated the experiments also with fog. So here you see the same type of experiments in the Dive, where the subject and the targets are now immersed in fog. And then we analyzed the data, including data of fMRI studies and of the non-human primates. And we had many results, which I won't have time to discuss in depth all today, but I wanted to bring to your attention. So in terms of time pressure, we saw that humans had a very effective strategy for dropping cues and ranking them in terms of their information value. And that gave us a lot of insights into how humans make these type of decisions when they believe that they're running out of time. We considered all information value functions in the literature. So these are some examples of information gain. We also consider probability gain, impact, and other measures as well. And from the studies in which the humans were under time pressure, what we found was that the humans changed the number of cues that they used to make classification decisions based on the time pressure. So when humans had no time pressure, they actually used all 4 visual cues. Again, these cues are the cues I mentioned before: shape, texture, color, and so forth. And when the pressure was increased, they progressively decreased the number of cues that they used, and in fact used the cues with the largest information value. And so we feel like this is a very important result. Here is actually the probability gain plotted with respect to time pressure. And you can see that, in fact, the probability of the model, which relates to the number of cues, increases monotonically with the information value. And so we can confidently assert that humans do select the model with the highest information value, and they do so based on the amount of time pressure that is applied. After that, we analyzed the results from the fog pressure, the sensory deprivation. Here are some examples of trajectories from the human subject that were recorded during the human studies. And we used several approaches for extracting the human decision strategies, and which include also moving about the environment, not just classification. We used both heuristics and influence diagram models. In terms of heuristics, we used many methods that were were available in the literature, as well as we by inspection, try to extract heuristics from the results of the actual experiments. So here are some examples of the heuristics that we investigated. These are the two that were the most plausible given the data. And we also trained an influence diagram model of the human decisions, which of course is learned from the human studies. What we found was that one of the heuristics, as you see here, the blue H2 fog heuristic, which is the one that adaptively switches between following the wall, covering the room, and all these, sort of behavioral situations, is the one that was the most plausible given the human study data by far. So, and the other one was the second best. So here you can see that we can quite confidently say that that is the heuristic that humans use in fog. When we actually applied this heuristic to the robot, we had this type of a path. And so here you can also see that the robot has a field of view, which in case of the fog is actually reduced. So all of that is taken into account in our simulations. We look at also robot studies to compare these heuristics to optimal type of strategies. So, for example, for treasure hunt problems, we have algorithms such as probabilistic roadmaps and also cell decomposition that give us the optimal solution based on the known Bayesian network model and on the known information from the workspace, which include the geometry of the field of view and the geometry of targets and obstacles. However, when we apply this type of optimal strategies to an environment with sensory deprivation, such as fog, we find that, of course, as we expected, the strategies are no longer optimal and in some cases fail tremendously. So in this case, we studied the robot with fog in both simulations and experiments. And here you can see how, for example, the ability to localize the target decreased significantly with the fog. As you can see, the error in localization became quite drastic as the distance from the target increased under fog conditions. And so we then compare these optimal methods, as I mentioned, cell decomposition, which is the yellow here, and probabilistic roadmap methods, which is the purple, with the human strategy and then the heuristic strategy that we learned from the humans but applied to the robot. And you can see that by applying this heuristic that was learned from the human studies to the robot was then able to outperform not only the humans, but also the optimal strategies that to date have been considered the state of the art. So we feel like this approach allows us to, of course, learn from humans. So on one hand, we are very interested in how do humans make decisions, but also how can we learn from that to improve autonomous systems. That was another one of our motivations. And the hope is also that by using methods that are more in line with how humans behave and make decisions, that we can design autonomous robots that are better able to interact with humans, as mentioned by the previous studies, for example, not only by interpreting their natural language and their gestures, but also by possibly anticipating or at least having some synchronicity or agreement with human decisions, and in some cases perhaps complement those decisions. As in many studies, we also found that the Bayesian optimal strategies that we use for robots and artificial intelligence significantly outperformed the human decisions. So with this framework, we think that we have a very good platform for moving forward and actually performing more studies also centered at robot-human collaborations. So this slide kind of summarizes most of our results, which are not all shown today, but I hope you had some glance or understanding of what they are. And I see Darius Barushka raised hand. So this is actually the end of my talk. So if you can just hold on a second, I want to quickly acknowledge my collaborators at Duke University, Mark Sommer and Tobias Egner, who performed the primate studies that I didn't have time to cover, and the human studies respectively, and also the team of students and postdoctoral associates who participated in that research. These are the collaborators who also helped with some of the robot studies I presented earlier in the talk. And then I just want to end with some information you might find useful if you want to learn more about the work that you have seen here today. In particular, our book is going to appear in June 2021. And also you may be interested in the TED Talk, Do Robots Dream of Electric Sheep, in which you will see a live demo of the drone experiments. And with this, I'd like to thank you and take questions.